This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
At the core, we don't believe fundraisers should be focused on prospects that they don't have a clear referral path to.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. Hi, I'm Jennifer Filla. Today I'm talking with Brian Gonzales, co-founder at WealthQuotient, helping organizations scale referrals to identify and access their wealthiest prospects. Hello, Brian. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. So glad to contribute.
I can't wait to learn more about your ideas on identifying, connecting with new high net worth donor prospects. But first, I'm hoping that you'd be willing to share a little bit about your career. Like, what led you up to starting WealthQuotient?
Yeah, well, it was a windy road for sure. I actually started my career in the nonprofit space and helped run a nonprofit in New York City that did counseling and mentoring with inner city kids. And so a big part that really was my entree into, wealth and engaging with wealthy people, as I was responsible for not only raising the funds to cover my own salary, but also the funds for the operating budget of the organization. And so did that for about 7 years. And then I moved to Atlanta and did consulting with nonprofit organizations globally. So not only was helping them with their strategic plans, but also with fundraising as well. And one of the big fundraising issues that so many of those global organizations were facing was, how did they become less dependent upon the West to meet their financial needs? And then I did the most logical next thing, which was start a wealth management firm. So I moved back to New York, and thankfully for my clients, I wasn't the one in charge of managing their money. My business partner and other folks on our team were responsible for that. But I had built relationships with so many wealthy people throughout the years in the philanthropic space that there was just trust that had been established. And so, my role was to bring business over. And so part of that was the wealthy folks that I had gotten to know through the years, but also a big focus of our firm was on professional athletes and trying to help curb the bankruptcy statistics that so many of them face. So helping them not only manage their money, but life as well. And then, I did that for a few years and never thought that was going to be the thing I did forever. And I was approached by a company that you might be familiar with and your listeners might be familiar with, called WealthX, which was just launched. And they had asked me to come and head up their sales. And it was the convergence of a lot of different skill sets and experiences I had. So I went to work. I wasn't a co-founder, although I felt like I was, at WealthX, and helped grow that business for the first 7 years of its existence. It was really the experience of all of those combined different things and what I had learned through that time, and as well as my co-founder, David Friedman, who was the co-founder and president at WealthX, that led us to start WealthQuotient. And WealthQuotient was launched in September, October-ish of 2016. So it's nearly been 4 years, and it's been a fun, wild ride.
That's great. I love it when all the different roles kind of combine to create a new experience for you and for your customers.
Yeah, it's been fun. And so much of what we're doing is not just something that we thought out of thin air. It is based on the experience and just hands-on working with so many different kinds of industries that are trying to reach the same folks. So whether or not you're in higher ed or a nonprofit, or you're at a private bank or at a luxury brand like a jet company or a jewelry company or a yacht company, you're ultimately trying to reach the same people. And so there was a lot of things that we learned as we observed what these different industries were doing that led us to starting WealthQuotient. So look forward to walking you through some of that.
Yes, so I heard you speak at the APRA Florida conference and was really excited about what you're doing. And I just kind of want to tease out maybe a little bit what that is exactly, because as researchers, and myself as a consultant, we get a lot of requests from people who they know they're not meeting their goals, or they're not going to meet their goals unless they really step up their game and start asking for larger gifts. And so they come to the researcher and say, get me that list of wealthy people, which um,
Mm-hmm.
the obvious question is then, how exactly are you going to get those people's attention? The rule of thumb has always been start with the people closest to you and work your way out. But people come at this in fundraising with varying levels of experience in how to cultivate relationships. So I'm curious, in your work, as you interact with customers like nonprofits, how do you overcome that desire for lists before linkage? Or do they come to you and they already know that they should have linkage as a priority?
That's a great question. I would say there's a bit of a disconnect that we see that often happens, which is when you ask the executives at these organizations, where are your wealthiest donors coming from and how did you get them? Most of the time, the answer is some permutation of a referral. But as we've looked at the fundraising strategies for so many different organizations and different kinds of organizations, they're really not based on referrals at all. And so what seems to be the trend and just a common thread through all of these different kinds of organizations, and I would say even across all industries, is the question of how do we actually scale referrals? How do we do that? And I would say part of the challenge is that you said that so many organizations start and kind of know they need to start from the inward, inside and move out. But I don't think that's how most organizations actually operate. In fact, what I see is most organizations tend to operate on an outward in approach. And we're actually getting ready to release a white paper with APRA Florida around this. And we did a survey with a lot of the Florida chapter members. And basically, to skip to it, what we found is the process that folks kind of undertake for how they qualify and identify prospects, we believe is a bit backwards. And, one of the questions that we asked is how often when you identify a prospect, does your fundraiser actually connect with that prospect? And you'd be shocked at how low that number was. The overwhelming majority of the respondents said it was 50% of the time or less. And 40% of the respondents said that it was that their fundraiser only got connected and access to that prospect less than 25% of the time. And I think that's because fundamentally the way organizations are programmed to work is on this outward in approach. And what I mean by that is when research shops are identifying and qualifying prospects, they're always looking for people with capacity. They're always looking for people that have propensity or affinity. But we actually ask the question, how often are you looking at and factoring in the accessibility part into your qualification process? What is the ability of your fundraiser to access that prospect? And it was almost non-existent. And so what we tend to see is every research shop on the planet, it seems, gets frustrated because their researchers identify great prospects and they hand those prospects to the fundraisers and the fundraiser doesn't act upon it or execute upon it. And so this frustration that tends to arise. But the problem is that accessibility factor has not been entered into the equation. And so by default, there's almost this assumption that, well, it's the fundraiser's job to figure out how to access that person. And that's a false assumption. That's not an easy job. That's not something most people know how to do. And quite frankly, it's not something that most people can do, is to just say, okay, here's this wealthy person that has capacity and affinity. I'm just going to get in front of them. And the path to accessibility is extremely challenging. And so we believe that that process needs to be reversed. But one of the first things that needs to happen is this acknowledgement that accessibility needs to be taken into consideration from the start. And that's why this whole inward out referral-based approach that we implement, we think and see is the much more effective path. Does that make sense?
It does. But I want to give you an example and then
Okay.
see how that meshes with what you said. So because I'm living this, I'm living these conversations and I struggle with it a bit. So one of the things I'll say to someone who approaches me and says, we need more wealthy prospects. And I say, well, let's start with those closest to you and work our way out. And then I give them ideas and I say, well, one thing, and I have seen this done successfully, is when we marry relationship mapping, what we call relationship mapping, with a fundraising strategy like fireside chat or an intimate dinner at your best donor's home or your board member. And then we take
Mm-hmm.
that board member and we start to look at all the relationships that we know or we think are likely around that person. Then the fundraiser sits down with that person and says, hey, I know you have your list. Let's look at who you want to invite. And then here are some other ideas. Do you know any of these people? And start to, kind of build outward that way, because people don't always think immediately of who they should invite. Is that like the kind of strategy you're talking about, or what do you mean by referrals?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think what we mean by that is there's a principle that we live and die by, which is you can't ask for generic open-ended referral requests. And I think that's become something that people are fairly familiar with, right? Sitting down with your existing donor or board member or development committee member, we call these people hubs. Hubs are people that, like you and your organization, you believe are very well connected and you think would be willing to make introductions if you asked. Sitting down with a hub and saying, hey, who do you know, typically goes nowhere, right? 9 times out of 10, the response is, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. If, on the other hand, I sit down with them, as you have pointed out, and I say, I'm trying to connect with these 7 people, these 10 people. Do you know them? Can you make an introduction? Could you invite them to our event or this event? That's something that they can execute on, much more efficiently. And so the process works, right? All the data says the more specific you can be, the higher the probability of success. So yes, that's really exactly what we're talking about. I would say in our process, what we teach is to let the hub, the referrer in that process, help qualify what the best course of action with that prospect is. So if you have an event that you're hosting and that hub is coming to, then by all means, yes, map out their relational networks, who are the qualified people that they're connected to, and ask them to invite those specific people. But it's also, just for interpersonal engagements as well. But to pull back, at the core of our conviction is that, to your point, the relational networks of your hubs, and most organizations have more hubs than they realize. They just aren't systematically looking at their constituents and saying, who are our best referral sources? So that's why we always say, let's start there. In the networks of those hubs, time and again, we find there are all the prospects you would need that have capacity and propensity. And now the accessibility problem is not an issue. We already know how to access these people. And so at the core, we don't believe fundraisers should be focused on prospects that they don't have a clear referral path to. And so when we talk about scaling referrals, it's just this very systematic approach of identifying who your best referral sources are. Again, we call them hubs, mapping out their relational networks, and then being very, very diligent to meet with those hubs and ask for the introductions to those folks. And we see time and time again, magic happens when that's done.
Magic. You use the word. I love it because I'm lining it up correctly. I've guided someone towards, really you need some kind of fundraising strategy to connect. And they are doing these intimate dinners, and I have the list prepared that they can review, and they review with the person. They go to the dinner, and too often, especially with smaller nonprofits looking to grow, they don't have the skill to take that connection to the next level. They don't know what to do next. They don't know how to interact with the person. And they wind up, what I see happening is they wind up chasing these high net worth folks. And high net worth folks hate to be chased. I mean, that they're just going to go running away. Like what do you do? Is the training that I saw on your website related to training them how to, keep moving with the relationship, or what's that all about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, our training is not so much focused on negotiation or putting together, complex deals or those sort of things. It's really focused on 2 things. The coaching that we provide is first on how to execute the methodology and the relational mapping. So we do provide relational mapping for our clients, but it's specifically tied in most cases to our methodology. And so what we're coaching fundraisers to do is how to first ask for the introduction from the hub to the prospect in a way that does not eat up all the relational capital that the hub has with that prospect, and when necessary, simultaneously deepens a relationship with the hub. And basically, we're helping them put together mini strategy plans for each of their hubs. What's the level of relational capital I have with this individual? And that's important because the context of the ask, how I position the ask, what I specifically say, and how many prospects it is reasonable for me to ask for an introduction to all depends on the strength of relationship that I have with that hub. And so we're helping them to assess that on a hub by hub basis, and then putting together, again, a strategy plan with specific timeframes when they're going to meet with those folks and what they're going to say and how many prospects they're asking for introductions to. And then tracking that progress with them in the organization as it pertains to ROI. The other thing that we're coaching them on, which speaks more to your question, is once they get access to that individual, how do they accelerate chemistry and trust with them? Because at the end of the day, the reason someone gives to your organization or your institution, yes, the cause has to be there, but ultimately they have to like you and they have to trust you. And so part of that coaching and training is around not selling too quickly, right? It's about earning the right to be heard, listening to that individual, and how do we engage them in a way that creates coincidences and accelerates chemistry and trust. And, everybody's familiar with the phrase, show up and throw up. And that's the last thing we want fundraisers to do, is to launch headfirst into the meeting with, this is our mission, vision, values, and what makes us so great and why you should give, right? So it's all about how do we build chemistry with the individuals that we're trying to solicit.
So you offer the whole package. You've got, let me help you find who can help you. Let me help you work with that person. And then let me help you create and establish those relationships with new people.
Yeah, that's what we're really trying to do. And again, we have a 5-step process and methodology. And I would say it's really all about helping our clients position themselves for success in the most effective way possible. Because there are so many times that we're just not thinking and we're running ahead and we end up doing more damage than we do benefit. And oftentimes we find, and I'm sure you've seen this too, that so often fundraising is happening in spite of itself, not because of the work that's being done. And it doesn't mean that people aren't talented and they aren't skilled, but even Tiger Woods has a swing coach. There are things that each of us can be doing to elevate our game and be more effective and more efficient. And one simple example of this in terms of our coaching is, oftentimes we'll be with fundraisers and they'll say, hey, isn't it fantastic? I cold called this person and I got past their gatekeeper and they answered. Or I was at this gala and I saw this very wealthy prospect there and I was able to go up and shake their hand and introduce myself. Isn't that great? And almost counterintuitively, we've in so many cases had to say, no, that's not great. And, people can be surprised until we explain, look, these individuals, and you hit on it earlier, are being bombarded all the time by people who want something from them. Almost on a daily basis, someone is trying to sell them on something or give them to give money to something. And so people are constantly grabbing at these very wealthy people wanting something. And you getting past their gatekeeper and on a cold call or, walking up to them and shaking their hand at this event or whatnot, there's a small percentage that you might connect with that person and it turns into something. But more often than not, they're going to view you as just somebody else that's wanting something from them. And yet, had you been more patient and come through a referral and waited 6 months or even a year until you had the right person to introduce you to that individual, you would have been elevated above the fray and all the people that are just grabbing at these folks. And so we often say that, your prospects are qualifying you just as much as you're qualifying them. And so typically they're qualifying you by 2 things. One, do you know who I know? And so the referral takes care of that sort of thing. Do you know who I know? All right. So-and-so has vouched for you and said I should meet with you. I'm happy to give you my time if, they say I should connect with you. And now I'm not approaching this as you're somebody that wants something from me. I'm approaching this from the mindset of, hey, maybe there's a mutually beneficial reason that our mutual friend has connected us. The other way that they're qualifying you is, do you care about what I care about? And so that's where the coaching that we provide around chemistry and trust is so focused on not selling too quickly, listening. It's going into, knowing what that person is interested in and cares about that has nothing to do with your institution, organization, or what you're trying to solicit them. Right? Dale Carnegie always said, if you want to be interesting to someone, you better be interested in them. And so what are the things that I need to take interest in as it pertains to this person? Not that I don't want to know where the overlaps are of their affinity towards what my organization does, but I also want to be a human being and not interact in a transactional way. And so part of that is having a bit of patience and being willing to engage them around the things they care about. And hopefully some of the things they care about relate to your organization. But again, it's just about not being so transactional.
Wonderful stuff. I really appreciate you sharing this kind of information. The audience is mostly researchers, and I think this will resonate with them and give them some language, I hope, to then talk back with the requesters for these lists and talk about a better strategy for achieving those goals. Thank you so much for sharing today.
It's all about efficiency and how do the two sides of the organization, the research and fundraising, work together in a way that makes the process more efficient and streamlined for both of them. So my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Exactly. Thanks, Brian. That was Brian Gonzales, co-founder at WealthQuotient, helping organizations scale referrals to identify and access their wealthiest prospects. And if you couldn't tell, it's really been on my mind that we need some kind of shift in how we're thinking about and approaching high net worth fundraising, and especially high net worth prospecting. Brian really seems to be coming at it from a different angle, with some different language too. I hope you found the conversation as helpful as I did, and if you did, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come check out the Prospect Research Institute's learning community. It's a membership community with powerful resources, great discussions, and comprehensive courses. Check it out at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I'd love to have you join me as a member of the learning community. See you there.